So last semester I took a U.S. History 2 course, and out of all the courses I took that semester, it was by far my favorite. I learned a lot of cool things in there, and there was one thing I learned in particular that interested me the most, and that was the Iranian hostage crisis, one of the longest hostage situations in recorded history. And it was so popular that they actually made a movie about it. Some of y'all may have heard of it. It's called Argo. Stars Ben Affleck, won Best Picture in 2012. It focused more on the Canadian Caper operation, which I'll get to later. But it was one of the best portrayals of the event, considering it was classified for many years. And it's one of the primary reasons why President Carter lost the election in 1980. The U.S. and Iran already had a pretty rocky relationship. They hated each other. They didn't like each other. So there were oil conflicts and a bunch of other issues. But one of the main issues that I think, and according to USHistory.com's article titled Iran Hostage Crisis, Iran hated its government. They hated it. They even tried to overthrow it. They wanted to start a revolution. And one of the most famous revolutionaries at the time was Ayatollah Khomeini, which he was one of the leading revolutionaries at the time to overthrow the government. Now, Iran's government was very similar to a dictatorship, except they were called the Shah. So the spark that lit the fuse was when the Shah at the time was sent to the U.S. Iran was pissed off. They wanted him to come back and go to trial for his alleged crimes. But of course, the U.S. said no. So this led 500 students in Iran that supported the revolution to go and overtake the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And they seized 66 Americans. Thankfully, based on archive.gov's article titled Selected Records Concerning the Iran Hostage Crisis, 13 were released just 2 weeks after the attack, which included all the women and African Americans. Many efforts were made, and a lot of them failed, except for one. Just a few months after the attack, 6 of the hostages escaped to the Canadian Embassy. And the CIA were trying to figure out a way to get them out of there and back to America, or just out of Iran entirely. So, Catherine Seeley from New York Times describes how the US and Canadian officials are trying to figure out a plan to rescue them. So, Tony Mendes, CIA, creates this elaborate plan that eventually pulls through and gets these 6 Americans out. An article titled Iran Hostage, Canadian Caper, 1979, No Secret to Some, that is a mouthful, from the Canadian website, CBC, mentions that the Americans escape in an operation dubbed the Canadian Caper, which I just described in Argo. It's a fake film crew sent by the CIA, and they needed actors. These actors, of course, were those 6 Americans. So they fly all the way out to Canada, rescue them, and fly all the way back to Germany, getting them out with no injuries. So a second rescue was attempted, and this was made by the U.S. and President Carter. It was a complete failure and a tragic one. During the raid, as described by Britannica.com's article, Iran Hostage Crisis, 3 helicopters broke down. And unfortunately, 8 servicemen died when one of the helicopters collided with a service aircraft. The operation failed, it damaged President Carter's image, and was a huge embarrassment to the United States. Months later, the same Shah that went to the US died. And you would think at this point, maybe Iran would give up the hostages, but of course they didn't. They were still pretty pissed off at that failed attempt of trying to send a raid to the embassy, so tensions were still pretty rough. Now, HowStuffWorks.com's cleverly titled article, Iran Hostage Crisis, I'm sure y'all are tired of hearing that by now, Iran refused to give up, and the Iran government didn't even care about the situation. They did nothing. They didn't care about the people revolting against their own government. They didn't care about the people that were being held hostage. So Carter continued to have his reputation damaged. Described as weak, America needed to wake up from this nightmare, which was Carter's presidency and this whole situation. So, fast forward to the election of 1980, Ronald Reagan shows up. Everyone loves him. And he had a famous quote, and it was, "A new morning, America. Wake up from the nightmare." So, of course, Carter loses. Minutes after Reagan was sworn as the 40th President of the United States, all the hostages were freed on January of 1981. In closing, the event was really captivating to me, and the rescue efforts failing was just a little weird because we were pretty successful up until that point. And it took a really long time. And just by guessing, how long do y'all think it took for them to be freed? Does anyone have any idea? 8 months?
Like 2 years.
444 days to be exact. To compare that with something more modern, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. It took the Coast Guard just 9 days to get 33,500 people out. That's 750 people per hour. Now, hopefully we don't have a situation like this again, and if we do, hopefully it doesn't take as long. Thank you.